This lecture is not about the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the conflict between Western civilization and the Muslim civilization. This lecture is about something a bit different. It's about the internal Israeli conversation about the conflict. Now, this is not an easy conversation for Israelis. Some say this is a conversation that is tearing Israel apart. And what I hope to achieve within the next half an hour is to help you understand, have a better understanding. Again, not about the conflict, but about the internal Israeli disagreements about that conflict. Is that fair? Thank you. So, maybe we should start with Jewish tradition. Because there's something very interesting, I would say almost bizarre, about Jewish tradition. One of those sacred texts of Jewish tradition is the Talmud. Now, I'm sure many of you heard of the Talmud. Now, what's weird about the Talmud is the following. The Talmud is all about arguments between rabbis. That's what it's about. Now, you see, as you know, Jews, we believe that there is divine law that we are commanded to obey. But then there is a question, okay, what did the law mean? And there's arguments between rabbis about the meaning of the law. Now, you would expect the sacred text to be a list of the laws. But that's not what the Talmud is. The Talmud is not the list of the laws. The Talmud is canonization of the arguments about those laws. Now, what does it say about a tradition that is sacred text is not the result of the argument, but the argument itself? What do you think that says about the Jewish tradition? So we have a tradition that cherishes a good argument. And the thing is, here there's something else that you should know about our tradition, about the Talmud. Let's say there's two schools of thought. One school of thought called Beit Hillel. The other, the alternative, Beit Shammai. Let's say it's like conservatives and liberals, just to get the taste. And there's a conflict, and there's a disagreement. And then finally, there's a conclusion. And the conclusion is that the law is according to Beit Hillel. That's how the Talmud is built. Jews are commanded throughout the generations to study Talmud, and they are commanded to study the position of Beit Shammai. You see, you're supposed to study and develop a curiosity towards the worldview that you are not living by. Is it possible for us to be curious about worldviews that we disagree with? That is the Talmudic challenge. That is an Israeli challenge. Ever since 1967, there's been a tough disagreement among Israelis. What I'll try to present now is a short biography of this disagreement. Six-Day War was a big moment for us. Before Six-Day War, many Israelis, many Jews, many people around the world believed that Israel is on the verge of destruction. A very small country, surrounded by an ocean of enemies, with a lot of capabilities and very strong will to destroy this tiny 19-year-old state. But then something happens. In only 6 days, Israel destroys 4 armies. In only 6 days, Israel more than triples its size. I have family and friends in North America. By the way, part of my family are Christian. It's a long, interesting story. I won't go further now, but I feel at home. I hope it's okay with you. My mom converted to Judaism. I hope I hope it's okay. Yeah. But so, by the way, my family's from Oklahoma. Anybody here from Oklahoma? Okay, so it's only me. So, but I was born and raised here in Israel. And from the American side, I've learned that a week before Six-Day War, so many American Jews were terrified that maybe this time Israel will be destroyed. And then when the war begins, they decide, let's organize rallies. And they organize rallies throughout, it takes time to organize a rally. Let's do it as quickly as we can. Within 1 week, we'll have rallies all over America calling the U.S. government to save Israel from destruction. The problem was that after a week, they all show up to these rallies psyched up to save Israel. Once they reach those rallies, Israel won. It took us 6 days to finish that, to triple our size, to destroy 4 armies. Israel won. Now, can you imagine the moment from the move from panic to victory? That transition changed the nation, changed Israel. And Israel wake up after a 6-day war, and Israelis ask themselves the following question: what do we do now? How do we leverage this victory? That question started dividing Israel. On the one hand, many Israelis wake up the day after. In Israel, we have a cliche that says, the 7th day of the 6-day war has lasted 50 years. We're still in that 7th day. It lasted 50 years. Now, on the one hand, we have Israelis waking up and saying, look at what happened here. The Golan Heights is land that Syria wants, and they're in our hands now. The West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, is land that Jordanians want, and we have. Gaza, probably not Gaza. But the Sinai Peninsula is land that Egyptians want back, and we have. The fact that they want it and we have it is our great opportunity to reach a deal. And many Israelis realize, wow, we finally have something we've never had before. Bargaining chips. And there's room for a big deal. We could trade all this land for peace. That is actually an official Israeli government a week and a half after the war. That was the decision. Echoed a few months later in a UN Resolution 242 that we could trade all this land for a peace agreement, and Israelis were excited because peace is an ancient Jewish dream. It's an important Israeli aspiration. It will transform Israeli history. We will stop being a fortress state disconnected from the area. We will finally be an organic part of this area. And by the way, when this happens, not only Israeli history will change, maybe Jewish history will change, because Jews experience their history as a history of being in a conflict with the world, different than the world. This peace deal, if that happens, Israelis started dreaming that then Europe will really accept us. We'll finally be a part of humanity. This is a redemptive deal. It will transform Jewish history. We had a tremendous victory, and we could leverage it to transform history and to live in peace. That was one dream. There was another group of Israelis that woke up the day after, the 7th day that lasted 50 years. And they had a completely different idea of how do we leverage this victory. They look around and they realize, hey, Judea and Samaria is ancient biblical Jewish land. Bethlehem, Hebron, Bethlehem is where our mother Rachel is buried. Hebron is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jerusalem is David and Solomon. Shechem, how do you say? Nablus is Joseph. This is our past. This is our homeland. And to top that up, this is also, there's ancient, I'm sure many of you are acquainted with, biblical prophecies that saw the day that the Jews will return to their biblical homeland. Meaning we are returning to our homeland. We are returning to our past. Meaning it's not about reconciling the relationship between Jews and non-Jews. It's only about reconciling the relationship between Jews and their past and the Bible and who they are. Yeah, it's a tough job. Yeah. And because this is a fulfillment of an ancient prophecy, once we fulfill it, guess what will happen? The next prophecies will start fulfilling themselves. And that will lead to redemption. If you think about it, we have two different visions of how you leverage the victory. One, to connect Jews to humanity. Second, to connect Jews to their past. But both are redemptive visions. Both believe that this will transform Jewish history. Who's right? Don't answer. This was a conflict that tore Israel apart. What do we do with this land? Do we give it to the Arabs for peace, or do we settle it for redemption? What do we do with this land? So this is an argument that tore Israel apart. But the interesting thing is that this argument changed throughout the years. I realize my time has shrunk, so I'll try. Nitzan, what's my situation? Yeah? Because I don't, just give me 15 minutes. That's not a lot of time. Okay. So something happened to both positions. And this is something that Israelis know, but outside of Israel, this is less known. The Israeli right, for the most part, has changed, and the Israeli left, for the most part, has changed. And here's what happened in a nutshell. The first Intifada breaks out the end of 1987. And now the first Intifada was violent, but very, the symbol of the first Intifada is a Palestinian child holding a rock. And in front of the Palestinian child with a rock, what does he see? An Israeli soldier with a helmet and a gun. And that is a powerful image and a disturbing image. Israelis like to perceive themselves as David, the small country destroying four armies. We're David, they're Goliath. Suddenly that image of a Palestinian child versus an Israeli with a gun. So, as I try to say, Israel is on fire, but sometimes it's only a false alarm. So thank you so much for being such good sports at that moment. And now I know something. This was a lecture you won't forget. So what? And me neither. We shared a moment here. So thank you for being such good sports. We have some 10, 15 minutes to try to wrap it up. And so where was I? First Intifada. Okay. I just don't want to say it again because it will trigger your alarm again. So the symbol of the first Intifada, as we said, it looked like we reversed roles. Now Israel is Goliath. The Palestinians are David. This was a very troubling image for many Israelis. During the first Intifada, Israelis are recruited to go to the reserve, to serve the army, to take care of this national uprising of Palestinians throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails on soldiers and settlers. They go serve 30 days, 40 days, if their officers 50 days, come back feeling somewhat disenchanted from the whole notion that Israel is in control of Judea and Samaria, West Bank. Israelis were saying, hey, we signed up to go to the army in order to protect our nation, not in order to control a different nation. And Israelis started going through a process, many Israelis, not all Israelis, of disenchantment, We're selling the hills of Judea and Samaria, which has our biblical memories planted in this land, in this ground. Israelis recognize that, hey, maybe our biblical memories are planted in this land, but there's another nation living on this land. And many Israelis became disenchanted. And the first Intifada was a very serious blow for the dream of achieving redemption through settling the land. And you see, the statistics are very clear. Before the first Intifada, only 20% of Israelis were for an independent Palestinian state. By the end of the first Intifada, close to 70% of Israelis are for the formation of an independent Palestinian state. That's disenchantment. That's a moment where we realize we would like to settle this. Try to imagine it the following way. Let's say there's a couple that wants to renew the romance, the passion they used to have, 40 years ago. I'm on camera, so I'll be careful here. But sometimes throughout a relationship in 40 years, it's not the same let's just say it's not the same intensity in the emotions, right? I mean, a friend told me that. It has nothing to do with me. A friend told me that after 40 years in a relationship, you get a little bit. So they decide we want to renew that energy, the romance. So they decide, let's go back to, to that place where we had our first kiss. Or where for the first time we looked each other in the eyes. And it's a park, some town. Let's go there. And we go to that town and there is a sense of déjà vu. You go into that park and there is a new sense of those memories awakening, and there's an excitement, and you find the bench, it's still there. You sit on the bench and something new awakens. You see, for Jews, that bench is the land of Israel. That's where our memories are planted. And Zionism is a return of the people of Israel to where Israel began, with the hope and vision that being in touch with this land will put us in touch with the memories attached to this land, and those memories will awaken our passion and our inspiration, enabling prophecy back to the world and bring redemption. I think that's an exciting vision. There's only one problem. In this metaphor, when we go back to the bench, there's another couple sitting there. What do you do? What do you do? Are you going to sit on them? What are you going to do? The first Intifada was a moment where many Israelis realized that in our land, on that land, there is another nation. Or even not a nation, a whole lot of people that we are controlling militarily. And the results are, as we said, the two-state solution at 20% in Israel in 1987. By 1993, 70%. That is disenchantment. Now you see, I want to share an insight of my friend Yossi Klein Halevi. If the first Intifada, which wrote a great book like Dreamers, which I highly recommend. If the first Intifada was a blow for the Israeli right and the vision of settling the land in order to achieve redemption, the second Intifada was a fatal blow for the Israeli left and the assumption that by a withdrawal from this land, we will cure the Middle East and achieve peace. If the symbol of the first Intifada is a Palestinian with a rock, who's the symbol of the second Intifada? The suicide bomb. Throughout the second Intifada, more than 1,100 Israelis were murdered when buses were exploding, malls were exploding. And you see, the sad thing is that terrorism works. Terrorism is an attempt to physically hurt a small amount of people but emotionally injure all the rest of the people. 1,000 people are killed, but 8 million people are terrified. And the purpose of terror is the psychological damage, not the physical damage. It's just that through the physical damage, which is relatively small, you achieve massive psychological damage. Fear. I got married 2002. All my American family, they didn't come to my wedding. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying. In Israel 2002, was anybody here at Israel 2002? Remember those days? They were scary days. You were here reporting? Those were scary days. Just sitting in a coffee place, you're like, looking around. You wouldn't have been that cool if you started hearing these noises, right? 2002. So in my wedding, we danced alone. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying it was scary, and terrorism works and injects fear. But you see, that's not the reason why Israelis, for the most part, stopped believing in the possibility of peace. It's not only about the violence of the Second Intifada, it's mainly about the timing of the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada breaks 2 months after the conference of Ehud Barak, Bill Clinton, and Yasser Arafat in Camp David. Now, there's many versions of what really happened in Camp David, but because this lecture is not about the conflict, but about the way Israelis understand the conflict, what's important is for you to understand how Israelis understood Camp David. What they understood is that Ehud Barak, our prime minister, offers Yasser Arafat. What did he offer him in Camp David? This is the classic narrative. What did he offer? Oh, you're saying everything that's very Israeli. Academics today so a withdrawal from Gaza, a withdrawal from almost all the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, partition of Jerusalem, compromise on Temple Mount. Bill Clinton writes in his autobiography that he couldn't believe it. That this is the most generous offer an Israeli prime minister ever offered a Palestinian leader. And he writes, and by the way, he was wrong. This is the most generous offer that an Israeli leader will ever offer a Palestinian leader. Why was he wrong, by the way? Olmert offered something more generous. We won't go into it. What was Arafat's response? No real response. By the way, it's right. Doesn't have to give a response. But the thing is, 2 months later, Second Intifada breaks out. There is a disagreement among the Israeli intelligence community between the Shabak, like our FBI, and Aman, the military intelligence. Avi Dichter, the guy who spoke before me, he used to be the leader of Shabak. Did Arafat initiate the Second Intifada, or did it just happen and he joined it? It doesn't really matter. What matters to understand Israelis is that after the Second Intifada, when buses are exploding after Camp David, Israelis couldn't accept the notion that all this violence is a result of the occupation. It couldn't accept that notion because all this violence erupts a moment after we offered to end the occupation. So the whole paradigm linking occupation with violence, that whole paradigm collapsed for many Israelis. Israelis started to remind themselves that, hey, the relationship between occupation and the conflict is the other way around. The conflict is not a result of the occupation. Historically speaking, the occupation is a result of the conflict. This recognition was a serious blow for the Israeli left. Now, let's put this together. Many Israelis learned in the first Intifada that we can't control the Palestinians and we don't want to control the Palestinians. And those same Israelis learn in the second Intifada, what do they learn? That we can't make peace with them. Where does that leave us? It leaves us the following paradox: that Israelis feel like we have to leave the West Bank. And we can't leave the West Bank. What I want to share with you is that The history of our ideas has two moments. One moment, post-Six-Day War. Second moment, post both intifadas. Six-Day War gives birth to two great ideas. Two intifadas cripple both ideas. Where does that leave most Israelis? Most Israelis today, we have a different right and a different left. Most Israelis on the right stop saying if we'll sell the West Bank, that will bring redemption. What they're saying is that if we'll leave the West Bank, we'll have a catastrophe. Most Israelis on the left don't say that if we leave the West Bank, we'll have a new Middle East, a peace solution, which means a secular version of redemption. What they say is that if we stay in the West Bank, there'll be a catastrophe. You see, what happened, the Israeli right and the Israeli left are images of each other. And they both moved from dreams to fears. Let me elaborate just a little bit more. The fear of the Israeli right is the following. If we leave the West Bank, I think the person who articulated that anxiety in the best form, the most persuasive way I've learned was Henry Kissinger in an interview he gave in Atlantic Magazine to Jeffrey Goldberg in the end of 2016. It used to be the Israeli right said a Palestinian state will threaten Israel, it will be armed with Soviet weapons and alliance with Iran, and will surprise attack. That used to be the argument. Today, I think the right has a much more persuasive argument, and it's the following argument. Henry Kissinger says the what we call the Arab Spring. Imagine the Arab Spring as an earthquake. And when there's an earthquake, when the land moves, let's say 8 in Dichter, Avi Dichter rank, when the land moves, any building that's not very stable collapses. So the land moves. And Libya collapses. And Syria collapses. And Iraq collapses. And Egypt has troubles. And Yemen has troubles. And we see the land moving and very stable traditional states collapse. So Henry Kissinger asked a very intelligent question. This Arab Spring, fueled by radical Islam, is shaking the Middle East. States are not stable or collapsing. Will a brand new, fresh, weak Palestine survive? Will a new, weak Palestine survive where Iraq and Syria didn't? And what if it won't survive? What if new Palestine will collapse? What if it will be a dysfunctional state? And that vacuum, and that non-sovereign land, who will enter that vacuum? Who do you think will, by the way? Who? Iran is one opportunity. What? Hamas is another opportunity. What? Hezbollah, ISIS. And you know what Israelis feel? It's probably all of them together. And that chaos will be a real threat, you know, in these small borders to Tel Aviv and to Jerusalem. See, this is very interesting. This is where it used to be that the argument was that what will threaten us is a strong Palestine. Today we say what will really threaten us is a weak Palestine. I think that's very persuasive. The Israeli left also has a very persuasive argument. Has the following argument. I know I'm out of time, so I'll put it. 3 bad things will happen to Israel if we have military control in the West Bank. 1, having military control over civilian population is unethical and Israel is collapsing morally. 2, having a military control over civilian population will isolate us diplomatically. For Israelis, by the way, something important, young American Jews have a tendency to be very liberal, and we are distancing ourselves from the Jewish world. It's a serious problem for the Jewish state. And finally, we will be defeated demographically. And this is the fear that troubles Israelis most. What will happen if in the land that we control, the Muslims are a majority? When that day comes, Israel has an impossible choice. Either we're a minority and in control of a majority, and then we are apartheid. Or we'll be a democracy, and there'll be a minority controlled by a majority. We are not a Jewish state anymore. In any way you look at it, it's the end of Zionism as we know it. Now, I find this a very persuasive argument. Don't you think? So here's the thing. If we want to protect our majority, we have to leave the West Bank. If we want to protect our security, we have to stay in the West Bank. So what do you do? So what do you do? Not all Israelis are perplexed. Some say there is no demographic problem. Some say there is no security problem. But most Israelis are. This perplexity I call Catch 67. Remember Catch 22? You know, you have a problem. The only solution to the problem deepens the problem. Here we have a Catch 22. Catch 67. Israelis are very perplexed about this issue. What happened to many Israelis in 2011, and with this I'll conclude. What happened to many Israelis that when they realized that maybe there's no way out of this problem, they started discussing other issues. That's a great way to deal with the problem. Like if we stay in the West Bank, that's a problem. If we leave the West Bank, it's a serious problem. So he started speaking about new issues, like the price of housing in Israel, which is ridiculous, like the price of cottage cheese. We actually started becoming interested in that. And this is a shift in Israeliness. See, it used to be that the conflict had a monopoly over Israeli political passion. Israelis, if you ask an Israeli, why don't you have a constitution? He said, you know what we should have. The day after we end the conflict, we'll deal with that. Why is it there's 19 families that control the Israeli economy? There's an assumption. I don't know if that's true. You know what? We'll deal with that the day after we end the conflict. Why is it that the ultra-Orthodox controls Judaism in Israel? You're right. Let's deal with that the day after the conflict. Israelis, for many years, focused on only the conflict, and as a result, the conflict held all other issues as hostages. Summer 2011, something big happened. Israelis started dealing with other issues. The conflict stopped hijacking the Israeli conversation. It used to be that if there is a rally about the conflict, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of Israelis will come to that rally, from right or from left. If it's about social justice, 10 people would appear. And the joke was, it's always the same people. There was this joke, you know, how when there's a rally, so there's buses that will take you from your town to the rally, and there's an ad, the bus will leave at 7 p.m. Well, if it's about social justice, we'll say the cab will leave. The taxi or the motorbike will leave. Yeah. So, you see, the conflict owned our political passion. Something happens 2011. There's new political passion not directed on the conflict. And the irony is, we always thought we'll start dealing with other issues once we end the conflict. What really happened is that we started dealing with other issues when we realized that maybe we can't end the conflict. But the truth is, the conflict, even if we ignore it, is not ignoring us. The conflict is serious, it's deep, it's frightening, and it's also interesting. What I wanted to share with you is not to say anything new about the conflict, but hopefully to help you understand in a deeper way the Israeli conversation about the conflict, starting with two big dreams, ending with two fears. It didn't end yet, but this is where we are. Thank you very much.